Mm.
Yeah. Here we are, live, waiting for Instagram. Should only be another moment. But today we have Paul Austin from the Third Wave on. How you doing today, Paul?
Hey, Joe. I am doing great. I'm in sunny San Diego. It's just a tad over 60 degrees outside. There's a lot of natural light coming in, and just feeling good. Got some good vibes happening overall. How are you?
Outstanding.
What's up?
Yeah, pretty good. Sunny day here. We had this like intense cold snap. It was like -10, -20 for a few
Oh,
days. Yeah. Um, yeah. I
okay.
imagine Michigan used to be that cold way back, but I have
Yeah,
no
that's why I
idea.
moved. That's why I moved to San Diego.
Right.
It's I think the coldest it gets here is about 40, and That's that's pretty rare. So, but you got out. It sounds like you're starting to ski
Mm-hmm.
and moved away from snowboarding, and
Right.
it's
Yeah.
better for your
Just trying
joints.
to fix this weird body that I abused for so many years.
Mm,
And it's feeling a lot better. Yeah, definitely
good.
feeling amazing being in my early
I'm glad to hear
40s.
that.
Yeah. So, man, excited to have you on. Thanks for joining. And today we're going to talk about a bunch of stuff, everybody. Folks, feel free to throw questions in, comments in. I'll try to get to them near the end. But we're going to talk about microdosing. We're going to talk about um, SSRIs versus psychedelics. We're going to chat about how to do, how to have that conversation responsibly. And hopefully we can chat a little bit about the RFK situation. The markets are saying 82%, the betting markets, which I get a kick out of the fact that you can bet on almost anything these days.
Yeah.
And probably also talk a little bit about coaching and how that relates to the psychedelic world. And yeah, excited. So, Paul, you kind of built like a huge foundation on the microdosing world and
Hmm.
concept. Like, and I'm
Hmm.
regularly still hearing people saying things like, "Oh, there's no science." I don't think that's true. And like, there's, and I think the science is getting stronger every
Hmm.
month, roughly. So it's fascinating, and we get plenty of case reports too. But what was it about microdosing that made you kind of want to like go in on it? And then also like, what are you seeing now that's like feeling really convincing?
Yeah, it's funny because we recorded our first podcast around this in 2016. I remember I had both you and
Mm-hmm.
Kyle on Third Wave's podcast. You were like our 10th or 11th episode, and I think it was a similar thing. So we were like a year in, and honestly, my belief in microdosing hasn't really wavered much since that point in time. 8 to 9 years on when I started Third Wave in 2015, the intention was very clear. It was at that point in time, really the only website that existed around psychedelics that was educational in nature was Arrowhead. And as you and I both know, Arrowhead is a fantastic resource, but for the average everyday person, they're not going to spend the time and energy trying to navigate that UX because it has a
Mm-hmm.
UX from like the mid 90s. And so I thought, okay, how do we create a website that's easy to navigate with guides around psychedelics? And around that time in my own life, I had started to experiment with microdosing. So this is mid
Mm-hmm.
2015. Jim Fadiman had just been on the Tim Ferriss podcast, and I had done quite a bit of high doses in my college years with LSD and mushrooms, but microdosing was novel. So I started to take a low dose of LSD, probably slightly more than a microdose now in reflection, maybe between 20 and 25 micrograms. I just had, white tab acid, and I would take little bits and cut them and kind of doing it the very, very old school way. And I did that for about 7 months. And I just found that it had a lot of these benefits around mental health. And I drank less alcohol, and I had um, less resistance to writing
Mm-hmm.
and just getting to work and being productive. So it was helpful for me on a personal level, but even more than that, I was, since I started Third Wave in 2015, I've really been driven by this mission, which I think we both share at Psychedelics Today and Third Wave, to culturally normalize psychedelics. And as I studied the literature and the research and the history and how we've approached these substances for thousands and thousands of years, what became very clear was they've never been culturally sort of sanctioned or culturally available on a global scale. If you look at the history of psychedelics, by and large, these have been, especially when done in high doses, they're very medicinal, very spiritual, very esoteric. That, part of the Greek mysteries or the Incan elite or the Vedic priests, right? These were the people who were working with psychedelics. It wasn't like anyone and everyone had access to them. And so when I started to look at the history of psychedelics and what we could do now, like what went wrong in the 60s, for example, what I landed on was I really think microdosing, these low doses of psychedelics, are a way to make this more culturally accessible and available. That if you lead only with very high doses of psychedelics, that, as you and I both know, there's intimidation, meaning people are scared to jump in the deep end right away. And so my mission was really around, I think everyone, or I shouldn't say everyone, I think almost everyone could benefit from psychedelics if it was done intentionally, responsibly. Just like I believe that to be true with creatine. I believe that to be true with exercise. I believe that to be true with meditation, right? That there are certain practices that are by and large beneficial. I thought the same thing to be true of psychedelics, but that a lot of people don't have the capacity to just do 5 grams of mushrooms off the bat. But if they could start with microdosing and seeing some really just fundamental benefit from that, then they may be open to doing these more deeper transformative experiences, or they may not, and they just may microdose, and that may be plenty for them in and of itself.
Yeah, awesome. You said creatine earlier. Did you see this one yesterday? Creatine boosting the effect of cognitive behavioral therapy in a really positive way.
I saw that when I saw something around creatine and depression, and how it could act as a great sort of add-on. And creatine is really interesting because it's, I think, the most studied supplement on the market. And a lot of people, when they think
right after whey protein.
oh, really?
Right, fascinating, right? Like two kind of like really popular things, and yeah,
like really widely studied. And a lot of people hear of creatine, they think, oh, it's just, I think of bodybuilders and, really jacked, water retention. And I don't want to be bloaty and all that. But turns out if you just do 5 grams of creatine a day, you don't have any of the bloat. And it's known to improve cognitive performance and energy. And I think also sleep, I've seen as well, it can help with sleep. So it's, I think, by and large, very positive thing.
Yeah, I'm somewhat new to it. But anyway, microdosing.
Microdosing.
5 dried grams of creatine. I like that.
Right.
So, yeah, I think you're right. Like it helps create this window of change, or it can help create this window of change where people can heal, have behaviors work better for them than they did before, maybe. Perhaps get some more insight. Like, what are some kind of like average wins that you've seen with microdosing? And then what are some like huge wins you've seen with some of your people with microdosing?
Yeah, average wins would be things around like I'm more present, right? I'm more responsive rather than reacting to things that are happening in my everyday. I notice that I have a little bit more energy, that my mood is better. I just can generally navigate my everyday life with a little bit more, sort of a pep in my step. And I'd say the bigger things are often around, usually the big breakthroughs are around people who have been on psychiatric medications that are no longer working, specifically SSRIs, and they really have nowhere else to turn. They hear about microdosing, they work with it, and it works. It really helps them to, not only navigate the withdrawal symptoms, but also as a ongoing prophylactic against the depression coming back. I think another really interesting use case is in performance and flow, which is what I often talk about. That people, like, I'm on acid right now, right? Like I did 10 micrograms of LSD this morning, and I did it because I had to write a book or a chapter in a book that I'd been procrastinating on for like 3 weeks. I joined a a men's group earlier this month. And so we have to set goals for each month. And if we don't, achieve that goal, then, I think I said I'd have to do 50 burpees a day for all of February if I didn't achieve that goal. And the goal I set was to finish this chapter 1. So I was like, okay, I have 3 days left. So I got up early, 5:30, started writing at 7, and I did a little bit of LSD because it helped just to get into the zone and sort of clear out the distractions. So I think that's another really big use case of it. It just can help people to get the sort of monkey mind to quiet down and get a little bit more in the zone and in the flow. So I mean, anecdotally, those are some of like the top line things. We can go into research next, but I'll pause there.
Yeah. We hear like miracle cases once in a while too, right? And I think this happens with any kind of intervention. We have like those miracle edge cases. So like, you see just the right physical therapist, and the situation is just right and your pain goes away after like a couple sessions, right? Or in my case, we did these like neuro PT exercises, and then my partner was like fixed after 2 years of like crazy disability. And then
Oh wow.
it was super interesting. And we see similar kind of wild case studies, and I don't know if they're documented super well, but like how what kind of wins are we seeing there? And I see people like talk about their asthma going away, chronic pain going away, postpartum depression going away. Again, edge cases.
Shingle.
Right.
I remember there have been shingles cases, these autoimmune issues, Lyme disease.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard around. I mean, one of the things that's pretty well established in the literature is cluster headaches and or migraines. My doctor of Chinese medicine here in San Diego, he had migraines for years, and now he just does LSD, I think once every couple of weeks, a small dose, and he's never had migraines since he started doing that. So I think there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of potential here, and I think one of the biggest challenges with microdosing is if this wasn't a Schedule 1 substance, we'd already have a lot of the research, because I mean we've known about microdosing for basically 15 years now in a substantial way. But because it is a Schedule 1 substance, it has been basically, I mean, there's basically been one study that I've seen that actually replicates how people actively microdose out in the world.
Let's talk about that. What was that?
Well, that was this Mind Biotherapeutics phase 2 study that was done out of New Zealand, where the principal investigator is Suresh, with a name that I cannot pronounce. Maybe you've had him on before. Guy from Sri Lanka, Mutha Naka. I don't know. It's literally the longest last name that I've ever seen, and basically, they gave LSD to 80 people, and because they did it in New Zealand, they were able to take the LSD home with them, rather than doing it in sort of a sterile clinical environment where they were just sitting there doing nothing. So they could take the LSD home with them, do it twice a week. This is 10 micrograms of LSD, the same amount that I did earlier today. And at the end of the 8 weeks, there was a 63% reduction in overall scores of depression, and there was a 52%, 52% of people were no longer depressed after those 8 weeks. And if you look at the chart of the research that they published, it's very clear that you see most of the efficacy after 4 weeks. So after they were taking LSD twice a week for 4 weeks, at that point in time, you saw a really massive drop. And then from the 4-week mark to the 8-week mark, there was a little bit more of a drop, but nothing substantial, which I think is an interesting point because it tracks pretty well with the initial microdosing protocol that Jim Fadiman made popular, which was do it twice a week for 5 weeks. And people are noticing now that, okay, if you do it twice a week for 4 or 5 weeks, at that point in time, you could see some improvements in energy and mood, because those are the two biggest factors that they found, but also sleep. They found in the clinical research as well through Mind Biotherapeutics that there was a preprint research paper that was published about this that it helped people to get 20 more minutes of REM sleep, not that night, but actually the next night. So let's say they would microdose on a Monday, and then on Tuesday night, they would on average get 20 more minutes of of REM sleep. My hypothesis as to why that is because when you microdose or take LSD, as many of us have experienced, you tend to be more active. And if you're more active, then chances are that more exercise, more activity will lend itself to better sleep at the end of the day.
So this shows how poorly I've been tracking microdosing. Like I thought that study was still underway, but it's like 2-3 years old. Like this guy was on the Tim Ferriss show like in 2022 talking about
Something
his
like
research.
that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I was just like, oh, it's still ongoing. I was waiting.
Well, I think they published the phase 2 maybe about a year ago, like the initial results. I believe they're now in phase 3 clinical trials for it. Like they've started those. But I think the part of the challenge with phase 2, from what I understand, is I do not believe they controlled for placebo. They could do a phase 2 clinical trial where they allow people to take home, but I don't know if they were able to control for placebo for that. And again, this is where I go, that's why it's like any of the research that's been done, there's like holes that can be poked in it, which is like unfortunate because, the other major research that's been done around microdosing was carried out by Paul Stamets and his team through Quantified Citizen. But that's a massive observational study where they're taking data from 7,000 people who microdose and then basically touch buttons on an app. And they found similar things, more energy, a better mood. But most of the clinical research that's been done in microdosing either is just giving people a low dose of LSD once or twice, like a lot of the research that's been done at University of Chicago by Harriet DeWitt is just showing, okay, this is how they respond to 6 micrograms. This is how they respond to 12 micrograms. This is how they respond to 20 micrograms. Or it's a microdosing protocol where they might do it a couple times a week for like 2 weeks. But every time they do it, they microdose and they're just sitting in a sort of sterile clinical environment, twiddling their thumbs and doing these really, like academic tests on a computer screen to figure out, okay, are they more creative? Are they less reactive? Are they whatever? Like imagine if you were taking a microdose and you had to sit in a hospital environment for a full day filling out, boring stuff on a computer screen, chances are your energy and mood wouldn't go up so well anyway. So, all of that to say is it's still somewhat inconclusive. And I think what we need deregulation of these substances, which is why I'm really excited for this new administration. As someone who has still never voted for Trump and would never vote for Trump, I am excited about what is the potential that we have with this administration to deregulate some of these scheduled substances. And ideally, we can actually start to do a lot more thorough research on these low doses of psychedelics, because I think if we are to have a quote unquote successful psychedelic renaissance, we do need more clinical data to back this. And we need to have a better sense of what are some of the not only the benefits, but also some of the risks, because there are questions about that as well that remain.
I want to throw in a comment from somebody on Instagram. Michael here says, my theory on microdose is that it works best after large initial doses, like a fertilizer keeping the new dendritic growth alive. I'd love to see a good controlled study with naive versus large dose users. Yeah. Any thoughts on that theory?
Well, it's interesting that Michael brings that up. I think there's an element of truth to that, in that what I've noticed and seen as part of our work with microdosing is that part of the efficacy is tied to the experience of feeling something. And of course, probably the counterpoint to that is, well, this is microdosing. Isn't it supposed to be subperceptual? So what's interesting is, as this conversation has evolved, Jim Fadiman, the sort of OG of microdosing, was very clear that microdosing is subperceptual. It is, you're not supposed to feel it. If you feel it at all, you've taken too much. Jim has been very clear about that. He still believes that to be the case. He's sort of adamant about that boundary and that line. Paul Stamets, on the other hand, believes it's sub-intoxicating rather than sub-perceptual. So it's a dosage that you could take where you might feel it, but you're not intoxicated to the level that you can't navigate your everyday reality. I tend to side more with Paul, because I do believe that part of the efficacy of microdosing is noticing some shifts and changes. Even if it's like the most common one that I find to be the case is an enhancement of your senses. So it could be often it's your sense of smell, but it could be your sense of taste. It could be your sense of touch, that people will just notice a slight elevation in that sort of sensual enhancement. and that the experience of that actually ties into the willingness for someone to continue that microdosing protocol. Because what I've noticed with some folks who start microdosing is they start to microdose, they do it a few times and they're like, I don't feel it at all, right? Like nothing's happening. Why am I still doing this? They get frustrated and then they give it up. And as we've already talked about, you have to do it at least twice a week for 4 weeks to really be seeing a lot of the potential benefits that people experience. So I think the upside to doing it after a high dose experience is you have that high dose experience, you have more sensitivity, you have more awareness. You're like, okay, this is what it feels like to be, in a psychedelic state. And then afterwards, you're bringing in that microdosing as a way to keep that, what I would call that critical learning period, open for longer. And I think this is one of the most fascinating aspects of clinical research that's been done over the last 5 years. I'm not sure if you've had Gul Dolen on the show, but you have, yeah. But she did the research with octopi and MDMA many years ago at Johns Hopkins, which helped to open up this context around the fact that psychedelics could reopen a critical learning period, and that typically it happens for about 2 to 3 weeks. Ketamine's shorter. MDMA is a little shorter, but psilocybin is 2 weeks. LSD is 3 weeks. I think ibogaine is longer. My sense is ibogaine might be 6 to 8 weeks because of the intensity.
They had to stop the study at about 4 weeks, just like due to predefined constraints on the research and / running out of resources for it. So they stopped it at 4 weeks, and it would have just kept going. And so you might be right. Like 6 to 8 weeks is possible, but we don't know. So when I see people talk about microdosing iboga or ibogaine, like I see them kind of understanding that they're going to just keep getting more and more amplified if they do a micro once a week, even, or every other week. It's interesting, and I think a lot of work needs to be done to like kind of characterize that better and have some safety worked out.
Yeah, because Iboga and ibogaine are very different than the classic psychedelics in terms of how they interact with the system, right? With LSD and psilocybin, typically I say for LSD, no more than twice a week. And with psilocybin, 3 to 4 times a week. But that after 6 to 8 weeks, take a break, of 1 to 2 weeks. I think it's even more important with Iboga to take more breaks more often because there seems to be more of a cumulative effect. But back to Michael's point, it's like, microdosing then in that integration phase, I find can keep people in the pocket for longer, keep them in the flow for longer, keep them in a more open, malleable state for longer, which makes it easier to shift and change our behaviors on an everyday basis. It also keeps them in relationship with that substance. And so one of the most common questions that I get is like, okay, I've had this experience with psilocybin. Can I microdose with LSD after I do a high dose of psilocybin? And typically what I say is keep the drug consistent. So if you do a high dose of psilocybin, microdose of psilocybin. If you do a high dose of LSD, microdose with LSD. Iboga, microdose with Iboga. Even ketamine. Ketamine is really interesting, and obviously this is a huge kind of point of conversation. But microdoses of ketamine are becoming more and more prevalent. The risk, of course, is that they have a higher addiction profile than do the classic psychedelics. But also, if doing high doses of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, there could be utility in microdosing ketamine, especially if someone is on psychiatric medications. That there are no contraindications with ketamine and the classic SSRIs, whereas there are, what we're learning is there could potentially be contraindications with the classic serotonergic agonists and SSRIs, at least at high doses.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting one. So, before we jump into like risks around microdosing and hypothetical risk, I'm kind of curious. Like, so say somebody's microdosing LSD 4 or 5 days a week. Like, are you seeing certain kinds of behavior come forward from them?
Manic, impulsive, overwrought, potentially insomnia coming online. I think the mania thing is the most relevant risk and most kind of highest risk because it's like it's like a psychedelic coffee, but a very intense coffee. And even now, Joe, I'll mention this just to be in full integrity. Like I'm microdosing LSD 3 times a week right now. I'm doing it every other day. as an experiment. And I'm just noticing the sort of the way different emotions are coming online is really interesting. Like I'm noticing some days I'm like, oh wow, sadness. Okay, that's really coming online. That's not usually present. Or like sort of this ebullient, joyful, where I'm just like everything is so good. So it definitely, if done more often, I find with psilocybin, that emotional variance will get broader and broader and broader. Which, if you know how to hold it, right, there are certain people like myself. I've been taking LSD for 15 years. I've been microdosing with it for 10 years. I sort of know my boundaries and my limits. And I've also tripped up enough and I put myself into a manic state before with it that I sort of know, okay, I don't want to go back there again. But for people who are new to this, you know, the people that I coach or the clients that I work with, or we even have now like a 45-day group coaching microdosing experience where people come in and we kind of coach them through a microdosing. I say, do it no more than twice a week. And that's because if we look at it from a neurobiological perspective, LSD is more dopaminergic than psilocybin. So there's more dopamine coming online, and dopamine is tied to extroversion. Dopamine is tied to energy. Dopamine is tied to, you know, the molecule of more. And so there can be a little bit more of that kind of just intense energy that can come online if microdosing with LSD quite a bit.
Yeah. And in my world, I see a lot of people using at the macro level a little too often, and my advice is always like, hey, like let's take weeks, if not many months off here. and,
Well,
you know,
and
mhm.
when I remember, you know, when I first started taking acid when I was 19, I was like, how have I gone my whole life without this? You know, like kind of helped me to feel finally normal, and I was able to release a lot of shame and guilt. And I remember for those 2 years from 19 to 21, I probably did a high dose of acid like once every 6 weeks on average. Right. And I needed that. And it was beautiful. Um, and it's not sustainable. Right. And so I do think what I've noticed when people come into this, and we've seen a lot of this over the last 3, 4, 5 years, people come in, right? They do become very enchanted. They have these really profound experiences. And then inevitably they take it too far. And next thing you know, they're drinking ayahuasca every 2 weeks, or they're doing ketamine once a week, a meditation at home, or they're, you know, taking LSD, you know, like once every few weeks. And look, if you have a coach, a mentor, an indigenous sort of elder as part of that process that is sitting with you and holding you in that, great. There probably could be some benefit to doing it more consistently in the early stages. But as you and I both know, 99% of people don't have that. They just love getting high and how it makes them feel. And
Mm-hmm.
that's why I love microdosing again, because it's like, you don't need to do the super high doses. Take these lower doses, make it more gradual, make it more incremental, rather than trying to just, you know, go for the home run right away.
Right. And I think there's something really important here around your your perspective, and I see this even in holotropic breath work. Like some people are not ready for a big experience. Some
Mm-hmm.
people really need to do a lot of work before that, and or maybe a big experience is not ever for them, and that's a big thing that people should really, you know, take into consideration when they're trying to make these decisions. And um, somebody in the comments, Michael's saying thank you for your bravery and self experimentation and reporting from the front lines. I recently kind
I'm
of
happy to.
had a
I'm happy to.
situation similar, maybe a month ago, 2 months ago. When was it? Early December, and it threw me for a loop for a couple weeks, and it was really difficult to land.
With LSD?
Um, high dose 2CB with
Oh.
a number of other things in the mix, and
Ah.
yeah,
Okay.
you know, I'm my line is I make mistakes so you don't have to, and I
You're the
try to
guinea
share
pig.
quite transparent. Yeah, totally. You know, weird, you know, philosophical hedonist here, so happy to share what I can
How
with
high
people.
dose of it? How high dose of a 2CP? I mean, the typical dose
I've
is like 20 to 30
22,
milligrams.
25
22.
to 22 is normal, and I hit like
Yeah.
37, but it was like 2 nights in a row. Um,
Uh,
get this, I was hanging out with somebody at the burn who was doing like 75. in one go. Yeah,
That's a lot.
and then I heard about an accident somewhat recently at about 120, 125, which is terrifying. You know, safe supply. This is why we need a measured safe supply, everybody. Like, so you don't have that accident and nobody you love has that
Mhm.
accident. They had a lovely time at 125, but it was very different from what they expected.
Yeah.
And yeah, before we go into risks, somebody has a question here, or Michael has another one. Would LSD in summer and psilocybin in winter be different to LSD all year long? I like the idea of rotating. What do you think?
I find LSD is like my best experiences with LSD have always been out in the mountains or in the woods or at high doses, at least out in the mountains or the woods in the summertime when it's warmer, or at least in the fall time. Back in the day when I was in Michigan, I would do that. Psilocybin, I just find, it has this quality to it that just makes me want to like go deep inside myself, and process a lot of emotion. So it feels like having that as like it feels like that's kind of the season of winter in some ways is what that brings about. Now it is nice as well when you're on mushrooms to go hug a tree. So depending on where you live in winter, I don't know if you want to be freezing cold outside when you're on a bunch of mushrooms, but
No, you don't.
that
And
that
somebody else
would
is
be the
asking
main
about other
consideration.
protocols here. Like, I think you get the Fadiman and the Stamets protocols. Are there other protocols coming out that people are talking about?
I mean, we talk about our every other day protocol with third wave, which honestly is not that unique or creative.
Mm-hmm.
So Stamets is 4 days on, 3 days off. That, from my understanding of that, that's really meant for neurogenesis, specifically with the Stamets stack, which is a combination of psilocybin, lion's mane, and niacin. And LSD, as we talked about with the Fadiman protocol, that's twice a week. That's twice a week, 1 day on, 2 days off. And again, my understanding is Jim loves LSD, so I think that protocol started specifically for LSD. I think from here, the protocols that I would like to see or learn more about would be more advanced ones. So we already talked about Iboga. What would be an ideal Iboga microdosing protocol? Is it once a week? Is it once every 2 weeks? Is it twice a week for a first month after a flood dose, and then once a week for the second month? Um, I've also been experimenting a little bit with combining LSD and San Pedro as a microdose, and very low amounts of San Pedro. Like, I'll do a little bit more after this conversation. So I'll do LSD early, first thing in the morning, 10 micrograms, and then I'll sort of stack on top of that about, not much, like 150 milligrams of San Pedro. So the average microdose for San Pedro is a gram, and the low amount is about 500 milligrams. So this is super low. But I'm also
Is this dried
noticing
powder?
dried powder with some other botanicals as well. But I'd love to know, okay, if we're combining LSD and San Pedro, or combining LSD and psilocybin for a microdosing protocol, what might be ideal? Is it one day? Is it a Monday on LSD, a Wednesday on psilocybin, and a Friday on LSD? Those are the protocols that I think would be fun to experiment with and require more intention. And then the protocols really should start to be intention specific. So my understanding of the Fadiman protocol, and reading between the lines, is he really meant that for people who were potentially wanting support in getting off clinical substances or psychiatric medications, help with depression, just sort of elevating it. I know he also talks about in the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, like flow and writing and some of these other things. But my sense is that twice a week is really ideal to help with that transition period. Whereas Stamets has always talked about from a neurogenesis perspective, and how can this really help to boost neurogenesis and dendritic sprouting and these sorts of things. So I think the next evolution of microdosing protocols needs to be substance specific and intention specific, because someone who is wanting to get off SSRIs will require a different protocol than someone who is like looking at microdosing as a way to be more productive, or access more flow, or someone else who might be microdosing as part of healing a relationship or navigating through potential relationship challenges and difficulties. So that's what I'd like to see as the evolution of these protocols.
Yeah, totally. And I really think we need to fund science here. So I'm hopeful. Polymarket saying 82% likelihood of RFK confirmation.
Well, I mean, what's your read on that, Joe? Like, I have my own thoughts and perspectives, but kind of what's your read on how accessible psychedelic science may become in the next 4 years, assuming the trends continue and what happens. And obviously this is very speculative, because if you had asked me at the beginning of 2024, I was like, MDMA is going to be approved and California is going to legalize psychedelics and
right.
We're going to enter the golden age, and neither.
Almost all my predictions are wrong, right?
Yeah.
So a caveat there.
What would you hope to see, though?
I would like to see very robust federal funding for psychedelic research of all kinds via NIH or whatever other funding apparatus there is. I want to see more science at universities away from philanthropic dollars, because philanthropic dollars don't necessarily breed the most authentic science, unbiased science. And if it's like, series of investigators across the world getting these federal dollars, hopefully a lot of it stays here, but I'm okay with other people getting these science dollars too. But how do we, like, that's my hope. Like, I've been part of this this lobby for a bit called Psychedelic Medicine Coalition. We did a lot of work to try to get science funding from the Fed, so they know we want it. And I think RFK might provide some signals that, oh, okay, we're ready for this. And then there's a number of things waiting in the wings that hopefully can get implemented quickly. And my hope would be that, like, within the next 3 months, we can start getting like really robust science funding to all the researchers that want to do this work and asking really important questions. The one question both you and I think want answered, like, primarily, like, efficacy, we kind of believe it already, but like what we like the primary safety thing is around this valvular heart disease kind of like speculative thing that's wildly speculative. Like, there's no way to know this like right now, but the idea is that with too much activity on a certain receptor site that psychedelics love to hit, there 5-HT2A, I think, there's like a thickening of a certain. Thank you. Yeah, I stay out of this. I live in a funny.
Well, it's hard because 5-HT2A is where most of the activity happens in the brain for the classic psychedelics, but the 5-HT2B valvular thing is where that concern is.
Yeah, thank you. And like Fen was doing this and we lost some athletes, but they were taking gigantic doses daily. And Paul, I don't know where you land on this, but like I think we would have a clear idea that this was a problem by now, based on the chronic use of folks like Amanda Fielding and the Grateful Dead folks and things like that. We just don't have any signals that this is real. And the amount of acid they used to eat, like, that would like, it's ungodly.
Eat or trepanate, one of the two.
Right. And like, that's funny. Like, there's, we would probably see that by now.
Right.
Some data.
Well, and the guy who so I first talked about this with Matt Baggett at Psychedelic Science 2017. He was the first guy that brought it up. And then Keelan Thomas has really taken the most of it, and he's the one who's talked about it in various media publications. I've never met or talked with Keelan, but my understanding of what he even has communicated is if you follow a microdosing protocol as it's been communicated, you're not going to have any issues. The risk is for people who look at microdosing as, let's say, a replacement for Prozac or Zoloft or Lexapro, where just like they were doing Prozac or Zoloft or Lexapro every day, they're now also taking 20 micrograms of LSD every day, or they're also now taking 100 milligrams or 200 milligrams of psilocybin every day, and it becomes like coffee to them, or like an SSRI to them, where they're doing it every day, they have no breaks, and it's just something that they can consistently take all the time. I think if you follow the protocol as it's been communicated, which is do it twice a week for 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks. I mean, hell, when I first did it, I did it for 7 months, twice a week, but I took 3 or 4 months off, right? So this sense of cycling I think is really critical and important. As long as there are breaks, as long as you are not doing it every day, I don't really see there being any sort of risk with it. And this is something that we could figure out shortly. I don't think this would not be a difficult experiment to set up. I think the bigger challenge, in my estimation, and this is what we're working on with the Microdosing Collective, which is a 501c3 nonprofit. Ali Shaper is my co-founder, and Josh Capel. Josh was the lawyer who was the co-campaign chair for Prop 122 in Colorado. Josh is fantastic, also co-founder. So we've been really trying to explore, okay, what will it take to create a legal regulated framework for microdoses of psychedelics where any adults can access this without having to go into a service center and stay there for an hour. And like, I think if you want to do this legally in Oregon right now, it costs you minimum $500 to be able to microdose legally, which is insane and ridiculous, So to me, so much of what is at stake here is accessibility around substances that work. This is really important. And if you truly want psychedelics to be accessible to everyone, there has to be a legal regulated model that protects consumers, so folks know what's in these microdoses, and makes it accessible and available to any adult who wishes to use them. And of course, the biggest concern or risk here is, well, if you can buy 30 microdoses, you can take a whole dose. But as you and I both know, a lot of people who are into microdosing, they don't want to do a full dose. They just want a microdose. That's why they're microdosing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder if the trick would be to like have a certain level of niacin in each one. So like it's stacked, so you definitely don't want to eat that much niacin, but it's good for you. But you don't want to.
My understanding is that's why Paul did what he did, right? That's a big reason why niacin is included in the stack, not only because it's a vasodilator and helps with absorption by the central nervous system, but you don't want to do that much niacin. It sucks. It really sucks.
Yeah, nobody wants that.
No.
I've only had it once, and it was a real ride. So I don't know. Like it's interesting to watch how Colorado is playing it out, like somewhat similarly to Oregon. I think Colorado is going to end in a better place than Oregon did by a long shot, but like the stuff around microdosing, the stuff around at-home use, it's like really regressive. And I think there was some even, stuff in the last couple of weeks that just looked really obnoxious and not really what the people of Colorado voted for.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. Yeah, and I mean the main upside to Colorado compared to Oregon is personal possession of all of these plant medicines have been decriminalized. So that automatically creates another level of accessibility that Oregon does not necessarily have. But when you look at the license regulated market for Colorado, like you said, one of the really key edgy elements of Colorado was that they were going to allow for at-home facilitation and at-home use. And in the last month, it looks like that has been sort of pushed back on, and that will no longer be available, which is unfortunate.
But it will evolve. Thankfully, the legal and social landscape evolves at a much quicker pace than like geology, at least. And I think we'll see some improvements over time. And I don't know if you knew this. You talked to Josh some, but Iboga, I think, is next in Colorado. They've shuffled around the rules such that a regulated Iboga is the next project.
Interesting.
Or Ibogaine. I don't know which one they'll end up with. There's like
probably Ibogaine.
I would hope, but it's this Natural Medicine Health Act, right? So everything has to be from nature, which is. I have this
Iboga just in that model, I think is problematic.
It's possible to synthesize. It's a little expensive. I think there's this. I'll put the idea out there for any engineer to take, but those like you can kind of culture cells from all sorts of plants. Like you could do this at scale with these plants that are really hard to import, and or find enough of to kind of circumvent the. At least we white people aren't impacting their supply. In a physical way. So I think that's a helpful angle. And I think people are working on that.
Yeah, because you have I don't know if the correct phrase here is cultural appropriation, but Iboga is meant to be done in sort of in an initiatory way, right? Like if you look at the
Right.
Bwiti as the core example of that, whereas Ibogaine it does have a much more clinical feel to it. And I spoke a couple weeks ago with Brian Hubbard, who was recently on the Joe Rogan podcast, and I'm sure know Brian, and I feel like that's having a big. He's on the warpath to get that approved, and it didn't work out in Kentucky, and so now he's trying in Texas with Rick Perry, and I do think RFK, again, assuming he gets confirmed in the Senate hearing today or tomorrow, ibogaine will probably be close to the top of the list. I think my sense is ibogaine and MDMA will be the two ones that see the most attention and interest because of the impact that they have on vets. I mean, we saw the study that happened out of Stanford about a year ago with TBI with all these Navy SEALs, right? So I think this emphasis on vet is going to be the core focus for the new administration to make sure they have access to this, as it should be.
Yeah, totally. There's a fun, somebody was talking about not necessarily prescribed, FDA approved iboga or ibogaine, but like a regulated pathway to it inside the government, because the approval is going to be a really long process, and we think we have enough data to do this relatively safely, at least safer than. Here's a tip. I talked to a researcher the other day, and that was the Nolan Williams paper that you were talking about out of Stanford. Apparently, a handful of weeks before, there was a similar paper published. I can't find it, but I think if anybody finds it, let me know. I'm really interested in reading it. But
on TBI specifically with ibogaine,
brain health and ibogaine, I think. So it very similar conversation. Yeah.
Well, and there's also, were they only doing ibogaine? Because I know the people that they worked with for that study, and usually those people are not doing just ibogaine; they're doing ibogaine and 5-MeO-DMT,
right,
together.
Exactly.
So I think that's also a big question: was this really just ibogaine, or was it the combination of ibogaine with 5? That's a big unknown.
That's a big question. So I want to jump into this conversation on coaching, and like you've done a lot of work on this coaching lane, and I'm curious, like why do you think coaching is an important angle for people to be psychedelically literate and maybe helping advise people on this stuff?
Yeah, great question. So to help set up a frame, right? When I started our training program with Third Wave, which is now its own brand, like you guys have Vital, we have the Psychedelic Coaching Institute. Our programs are very similar. Probably the main distinction is, my sense is, you're a little bit more medical therapeutic focused, whereas we are a little bit more sort of leadership, performance, well-being focused. Partly I've made that choice because that's my background. I've never had a clinical diagnosis. I got into psychedelics. They definitely help with like shame and guilt and understanding my relationship with my mom and my parents and, loving myself and these other things. But honestly, the biggest impact that they had on me was they really inspired me to think differently, and they inspired me to not be held down or tied to the sort of conventional path. Because I grew up quite religious. I grew up in West Michigan in a small town. When people figure out where I'm from and what I'm doing now, they really can't believe it. So it inspired me to go, oh, like life is very malleable. I can make of it what I want to make of it. I just have to be clear about what I want. And if I'm clear about what I want, then I think I have the capacity to bring that into existence. And so that's been really a core thread for a lot of my psychedelic work. I mean, it's helped open my heart more and helped me to be. Whoops, can you still see me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, my computer screen. I haven't touched my thing in so long that my screensaver came up. So, and I, that's been the rod that I've often held in this space is. It's so incredible what psychedelics can do for depression and PTSD and addiction and anxiety and TBI and OCD and autism and you name it, right? There's a lot of, and now autoimmune conditions. There's so much that it can do from a healing perspective, both of the psychological but also the physiological. I think we need these tools to help solve our mental health crisis. I believe we are also living at a sort of moment in time where we also need to we need a new story, right? We need to not only be stuck in how do I heal from what's happened to me or the past, which I think therapy does a really good job of. How do I come to terms with my existence? But we also need to be inspired to create. Right. One of my values or beliefs is that I fundamentally believe that we are creators, right? And our greatest skill as a human being is to create. And I find that psychedelics are phenomenal tools to support that process. And so I think the big distinction then between coaching and therapy is coaching is really asking these greater questions about, what is it that you want to bring into the world? Whereas therapy is more asking the question of how do you come to terms with what has happened to you in this life? And there's overlap there because, as Jung has so often talked about, there's gold in the shadow, right? When we do our shadow work, when we go into the darkness, when we go into that, we end up. It creates depth, it creates power, it creates the capacity to to transmute and to transmute that shadow material. But I really think we're at a point in time where we have to ask what's next. And I know you've shared this Bucky Fuller quote, and it's one of my favorite quotes, and I'm probably getting it wrong. I seem to always get it wrong, but it's something along the lines of you don't fix a broken system, build a new system that makes the old system obsolete. And I think one of my critiques of the current psychedelic renaissance is we're really just trying to fix this broken system of mental health, of the DSM, of applying psychedelics within this one-to-one psychiatric prescribed framework. And I don't think it works like that. Like, I don't think that these are ideally used in that way. And I'd much rather ask the deeper and more difficult questions of both individually and collectively. How can these inspire us to actually build something that's totally and that's totally completely unique, and that is rooted in what I would call sort of sort of a Lindy framework. And the Lindy framework, or the Lindy effect, is a frame that has been popularized by Nassim Taleb, who is such an asshole on Twitter that it makes for great entertainment, but a brilliant, brilliant writer and philosopher. And he talks about how the longer an idea or technology has been around, the longer it will be around. And so we started this podcast talking about the history of psychedelics, probably wrap as well and end it. It's like, yes, there's new paradigms we want to bring online. There's more time and energy and attention that we want to spend in group work, in these church models, thinking about sort of not only the individual healing, but sort of collectively, how can we create more group peak experiences, group ecstatic experiences for people? And there's something very ancient about what we are coming back into, and the fact that psychedelics have been around for thousands of years. There's wisdom there. And so I think when we think about it from a coaching lens, so oftentimes people hear of coaching, they think of business coaching, they think of executive coaching, they think of what I would consider to be very sort of mundane or profane outcomes that they're looking to achieve through coaching, very basic. But I think the greater opportunity here is to really, how can we transform our world and our lives by being inspired to think differently and to think bigger. And so that really is my end goal is in doing our training for practitioners and focusing on more so executive coaching and health and wellness and leadership performance, these sorts of things. I really want people to think outside the box. I really want people to think differently and be inspired to create. That we should really all be aligning on not what has happened to us, but just looking at life as objectively as we can and asking, what do we want to make of it? Like, what do we want to create together with the opportunities that we have?
Mm. That's amazing. And I love the idea of, having that kind of Bucky orientation going in. I was listening to somebody tell his story the other day. He was making the decision, am I going to kill myself or not? And he said, why don't I just commit the rest of my life to making to an experiment to see how much of an impact one person can have for the positive for the planet. And I love that. What a brilliant gift. And yeah, like
And
these. Go ahead.
well, I think Camus wrote about that. One of my teachers and mentors, this guy El Nor, who started Brave Earth, Tierra Valiente in Costa Rica. We do our practitioner trainings there. He had me read The Myth of Sisyphus, which was written by Camus. It's like a 10 to 15 page essay, and it's a book about the ethics of suicide. And what Camus says, using the example of Sisyphus, is Sisyphus, he took on the burden and he was happy doing it. And I feel like that's sort of what life is we all have a burden that we carry, and how do we still show up for it and recognize what our burden is and how we do it regardless. The counterpoint to that is suffering is optional, and we don't need to feel like it's such a burden. But I do think, life can be heavy at times, and if there's if there is a drive and a willingness and a deeper purpose, which oftentimes with psychedelics is this mystical, connection to source, God, oneness, there's something really deep and moving that moves through in that, then we remember that both this is very serious, right? That lives are at stake, including our own. And I think we also remember that it's a game that we are making up as we go along. And the capacity to balance levity, the playfulness, with the gravity and the depth and the seriousness, I think is one of the greatest skills that psychedelics can teach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks for that. It's heartening to know that you're going for people who can make gigantic change in like a small group setting, right? Like they and their company could have a gigantic impact or whatever they're up to, right? And understanding how to use these things in a skillful way for positive ends. It's amazing.
That's my hope. It's not so much, some people hear this and they think, oh, it's like a trickle down effect, like trickle down psychedelics. And I think it's different than that. It's the humility, ideally the humility that comes online from deep psychedelic work allows us to return to the wisdom of our elders that we've lost touch with, and I think there's something real and something very true about, there's this phrase soul retrieval, which is quite kind of common and relevant in indigenous elder circles, right? Mm-hmm. And I think from a Western lens, collectively, we are in this massive process of soul retrieval. And it feels like psychedelics are one of, if not the main tool that is supporting and helping us to do that. And it feels like, especially in the age of AI, increasingly important and relevant as we bring this sort of superhuman intelligence online that doesn't really have much of a soul, as well. I mean, it depends how you define that, but it's probably a whole nother conversation.
Did you ever read Greg Kaiser's Dear Machine?
No, but you're probably the third person that told me about it. Is it good?
You can check out the podcast of the show. It's worth it. It was like a letter to the coming superhuman AI. And it's pretty much explaining ourselves. It's like, hey, let me explain myself before you do something. And
did you watch?
Go ahead. Psychedelics helping us understand them and them understand us a little bit better.
Did you see that's cool. Greg Kaiser is the one. Did you see the TV show, what was it? The 3 sun problem or the 3 planet problem, or
no? Is it related to the AI thing?
Also, yeah, I'm Googling 3 body problem. So the 3 body problem is a classic issue in celestial mechanics that involves predicting the motion of 3 celestial bodies moving under no influence other than their mutual gravitation. In popular culture, the 3 body problem is also the title of a 2008 science fiction novel by Chinese author. I'm not going to try it. but they talk basically the Netflix show and the book is about this ancient or this alien civilization that uses VR to recruit humans that will support them coming as aliens to planet Earth. And I think it's just very, very odd that
Mm-hmm.
at about the same time that sort of an AI super intelligence is starting to come online, we're also having sort of disclosure around aliens and, them becoming more potentially real or true. And I don't think that's a coincidence necessarily.
It's a really funny meme I saw the other day. It's a cartoon somebody draw. It's like, hey, we're here, we're aliens. The guy's like, well, I'm having kind of a hard time lately, so we'll see you later. Just kind of like so burnt out, so like overwhelmed. It's like, yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Let's see ya.
That's what it feels like, right? Because we had the New York Times feature and the CIA has talked about it. I bought this book called Imminent, which is by this former CIA officer that's talking about how, look, these things are real. Like the Roswell thing is real. And it just feels like nobody has the capacity to give a fuck.
I'll give you a book tip here. Oh god, it was a biography on John Mack, who is the Harvard kind of psychedelic psychiatrist who started treating people for trauma induced by alien visitation. We've had the author on the show. I think the book was called The Believer, and the he was close with Stan Groff. He was a worldwide anti-nuclear activist. He was always trying to do peace in the Middle East work. I think he had a Pulitzer too for something about D.H. Lawrence he wrote. He's a fascinating dude, very in the know on the psychedelic front. What did he say? I didn't believe in aliens, and then Stan Groff's Holzberg breath work put a hole in my brain, and that's how the aliens got there. Something goofy like that. Funny quippy line, but brilliant guy, and we've got a couple episodes. I think we did some articles on him ages ago. He's a favorite.
John Mack or
John Mack.
And he was the author of this book, The Believer.
He was the subject of the book.
He was
the guy that wrote the book did a lot of these kind of like Navy pilot UFO stories for New York Times. He was, I think, broke some of those stories in the Times. So I forget his name, but brilliant. John Mack, definitely worth knowing about.
Well, and this is what McKenna would often talk about, right? If you read Archaic Revival, his Terence McKenna's sort of first collection of pieces, there's quite a few in there about disclosure in UFOs and why are we so obsessed with UFOs and why are we so obsessed with aliens. And so I haven't seen any really sort of comprehensive book or thinking on this, but I mean, to explore this overlap of aliens, AI, and psychedelics would be pretty fascinating. I know like Andrew Gallimore has maybe touched on it a little bit, and we had David J. Brown in our podcast as well to talk a little bit about more the alien and DMT sort of psychedelic realms, but I haven't seen anyone cover that in a comprehensive way. Like, why are all these three topic subjects, technologies coming to a head at about the same time? What is that saying? What does that mean?
It's Michael Lavanda is the guy I think who's doing the most serious work on this, and it's like the intersection of like psychedelics, weird, high weirdness, as Eric Davis puts it, and the alien thing, the occult thing, like all of these things as like a convergence of phenomena and like this sense of the other. Peter Lavanda, I think is his name. Let me be sure. And he was fascinating, and he's been around for a long time. He wrote the book called Unholy Alliance and a number of others, and he's definitely worth checking out if you're interested in this like convergence of strange topics.
Okay, Peter Lavanda. I feel like Robert Anton Wilson sort of tackled that as well in the 80s.
There's new data.
It was a long time ago.
Wilson did amazing, and I like this term ultra terrestrial as opposed to ET, and it's like I've heard some new things about like these things aren't visiting us; they were already here. Like I find like it interesting that they could be like Earth based in some way, but who knows? I think we need to do a lot of work before we know anything. And Sasha Shulgin had these lines of like, we're too immature of a species to know what's real and not real yet. Like we have a long way to go before we can have real conclusions about, the we call it ontological status of things.
Right.
Yeah, we'll get there maybe.
Maybe
Yeah.
before extinction.
So, Paul, anything else you want to share with the audience before we wrap here?
No, I mean, I would just encourage folks, if folks are interested in doing like a proper microdosing protocol and they want to join us, we have a 45-day microdosing experience that we do usually once a quarter. So folks can learn more about that on Third Wave. And besides that, I appreciate you having me on, Joe. And
Absolutely.
it's always a pleasure to catch up and go deep with you. So thanks for creating this platform and having me back on.
Absolutely, Paul. Thanks for making it, and can't wait to do it again.
Can't wait.
All right. Thanks, everybody.